just reiterate some reminders before we begin. Make sure to have your name and affiliation in your display name so we can better recognize you, and just so we know who are with us and who's talking. For security purposes, we may remove you or not call you if you do not have both your name and affiliation in your display name. We encourage active discussions, so please feel free to type your comments and questions into the chat box as early as now, and even while our speakers are talking. We'll get to them during the Q&A. And to avoid disruption during the program, we hope you can mute all your mics. Your mics will be automatically muted when the program starts. The mics will be enabled again if you are called during the Q&A. And later during the Q&A session, please type your question in the chat box or raise your hand to be called or recognized. So today's session is being recorded for our documentation purposes, and we hope that you can like and follow us on Facebook. The QR codes flash on your screen. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Coco, the Executive Director of the Makati Business Club.
Oh, Bettina, I thought you were doing Bettina,
Yeah?
I thought you were doing this. Good. I actually don't have the script before me because Bettina's going to do this. I just want to say hello to everyone and thank you for joining us. I'll turn back to Bettina for the intro.
All right. Well, good morning again, everyone. Well, we'd like to we'd like to welcome you to this is actually our first MBC economic briefing, and we plan to do this at least once a quarter. This is in collaboration with the American Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, and we're very glad to collaborate with them. So the goal of our economic briefing is basically to focus on important economic issues and events. So it would really depend on current events and current developments. And with that, we'd like to thank our sponsors for making this event possible, Mondenisan and the Philippine National Bank. Our first topic for our first economic briefing this year is for the recently launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the Biden administration announced earlier in the year and launched last month. And with that, I'm honored to turn over to Ambassador Jose Quisia, our board member, and he was Philippine ambassador to the U.S. from 2010 to 2016, and he'll be doing the welcoming remarks. Ambassador Quisia.
Thank you, Bettina. Good morning to all of you. On behalf of the Makati Business Club, I would like to thank everyone here for joining us this morning. Special thanks to the American Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, or AmCham, for partnering with us in this forum. A special welcome to their excellencies, Ambassador Joharia Wahab of Brunei Darussalam, Ambassador Agus Wijojo of Indonesia, Ambassador Gerard Ho of Singapore. I also would like to thank our trustee, Dr. Aris Alip, and of course, our Executive Director, Coco Alpas, for joining us this morning. As Bettina said earlier, this is the first event in Makati Business Club economic briefing series, which we designed to help our leaders to be better informed on important political and economic issues. Today's briefing is on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, also known as IPEF. President Joe Biden launched IPEF in May this year, his latest effort to compete with China politically and economically in the region. Right now, we're all concerned about and affected by the Russia-Ukraine war. But many, if not most, geopolitical players and observers believe China-US relations is the most important dynamic of this century and will only continue to be even more important. But hopefully, the current tensions and conflicts will not lead to war. IPEF comes at a time when countries are ratifying the China-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. The IPEF is a framework designed to advance resilience, sustainability, inclusiveness, economic growth, fairness, and competitiveness for the economies which are part of this grouping. If successful, the IPEF will affect a big chunk of the world's population. It should be noted that around 60% of the world population reside in the Indo-Pacific region. The 14 participating countries of the IPEF represent 40% of global GDP. The Philippines' total trade with the IPEF's target signatories is about $107 billion, about 54% of its total trade with the world. But unlike RCEP and most multilateral agreements, IPEF is not a free trade agreement. It doesn't promise to lower tariffs. It is a far cry from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Obama administration proposed, and I strongly supported when I was serving in the US as the Philippine ambassador to the US. Unfortunately, the Trump administration scuttled that agreement. Instead, IPEF proposes guidelines for what it calls the 4 pillars. 1, digital, environmental, and labor rules. 2, supply chain resilience. 3, decarbonization. And 4, tax and anti-corruption measures. DTI, or Department of Trade and Industry, recently said that they are supporting IPEF because it is likely to benefit the Philippines through the incentives it will come with. While specific incentives have not been announced, analysts see benefits to IPEF economies through the allowing of freer flow of data and information. DTI also said that it will help expedite the passage of domestic reforms aligned with IPEF pillars. But if the US is not promising lower tariffs, what incentive is there for countries to agree to these rules? Many analysts are asking, if there are no tariff incentives, what chance is there that countries will sign on? And with numerous requirements and possible hurdles, what does the US hope to accomplish with these proposals and succeeding talks? This indeed brings about the question, what's in it for us? For one, what would be the implications of joining the IPEF as we continue to build stronger relations with China? I look forward to hearing our guest speaker, Greg Poling, address these questions with his deep knowledge of the region, which I especially appreciated when I was representing our country in the US. He was particularly helpful in providing us information and even photos about the Chinese incursions into our exclusive economic zone. On that note, I am pleased to invite Mr. John Everett of the US Embassy to formally introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Quija. Thank you for those remarks, and it's great to be with you all here this morning. I echo Ambassador Quija's remarks about the collaboration between AmCham and the Makati Business Club, and look forward to more events like this in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Greg Poling directs the Southeast Asia Program, an Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he's also a senior fellow. He is a leading expert on the South China Sea disputes and conducts research on US alliances and partnerships, democratization, and governance in Southeast Asia, as well as maritime security across the Indo-Pacific region. He's the author or co-author on works on the South China Sea, US relations with Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia at large. His writings have been featured in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and the Naval War College Review, among others. Mr. Poling received a master's in international affairs from American University and a bachelor's in history and philosophy from St. Mary's College of Maryland. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the floor to Mr. Greg Poling. Thanks, Greg.
Well, thank you so much, John, and AmCham and the Makati Business Club for hosting me. Coco, it's really great to be invited. And particularly thank you to Ambassador Quisha for setting me up so well. He stole all of my talking points, which is unfair. We worked across the street from each other for years. He knows everything I'm going to say. It really is great to see everybody. I wish we could be doing this in person. Ironically, I was in the Philippines 2 weeks ago for my first international trip since COVID, but I only got to spend 2 days in Manila before flying out for speaking engagements in Cebu and Puerto Princesa. So I'll be back in a month. I hope I can call on Ambassador Quisha and Coco and others then. And in the meantime, we're back to Zoom, which we've all figured out over the last 2 years, right? 2.5 years. So IPEF is a difficult topic in some ways to talk about because it really, it's like a Rorschach test. It's in the eye of the beholder, whether or not you think IPEF is the start of something great, or whether or not you think it's just talk, just rhetoric. Largely depends on what your preconceived notions are about U.S. economic engagement and the state of the regional economy. I would count myself as cautiously optimistic. So as Ambassador Quisha said, this is not the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it's now called. This is not even the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the ASEAN founded and now in many ways China-led economic bloc, which I'll note the Philippines has not ratified and is not likely to anytime soon. And neither has Malaysia or several other ASEAN states. But this is the best we have, right? So as an American analyst whose job is to provide advice to the US government, I think it's in the best interest of the US and like-minded partners and allies to make IPEF, as we call it, succeed, because it's really the only option on the table. It's no surprise, no secret to anybody on this call, I'm sure, that at least since the collapse of US participation in TPP at the beginning of the Trump administration, the US has really had no economic strategy, no coherent economic strategy for the region. Now, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean the US hasn't had economic engagement. And I think it's, when US officials and, poor John and his team have to respond to these questions, the first thing they'll do is point out that the US remains, the largest stock of investment in the Philippines and most other ASEAN countries, a major trading partner for all the region, the second largest source of development assistance. And all of that is true. And all of that is driven, other than the ODA part, by the US private sector. So the US is a major economic partner still of the region. What has been missing is economic rulemaking, right? So the US is engaged, US companies are engaged in many ways, in more productive ways than their Chinese counterparts. But the US government has not been engaged in making the rules for the 21st century economy, whether it's digital economy or green energy and decarbonization or anything else. So IPEF is, I suppose, a half step back into that. The Biden administration, stocked in many cases by former Obama administration staffers, many of whom helped drive the TPP process, understand this. They understand how much Asian partners need the US to be engaged on more than the security and the diplomatic front, that they need US economic engagement. And that without it, many in the region feel that China's given far too much free rein, that China gets to set its own rules if the US is absent. So, why IPEF, right? The big question, I think, from many Asian diplomats in Washington, for the last year has been, why not just rejoin TPP? If everybody in the Biden administration knows that we should rejoin TPP, and all of our partners know we should rejoin TPP, why didn't we rejoin TPP? And the answer is largely domestic politics. Do I think that Joe Biden probably thinks we should rejoin TPP? Probably. I'm certain that all of the Asia hands in the State Department and the National Security Council, and even the Department of Defense, know that we should rejoin TPP because most of them are on the record saying so. And the Commerce Department probably agrees. The Commerce Department's job being to promote US businesses abroad. But there is a loud and powerful contingent of the Democratic Party that opposes free trade agreements almost on principle. And they are no longer the powerhouse they once were. I mean, unions and their protectionist message are not driving the Democratic Party in the way they did in the 1990s and 2000s. And a lot of polling now shows that Democrats, on balance, are more supportive of free trade and globalization than Republicans are. But President Biden was elected by a narrow margin. The Senate is 50-50. He has the thinnest margin imaginable in the House of Representatives. He cannot afford, in his mind, I think, to upset even a small but important part of his Democratic coalition, particularly because he was so focused in his first year on domestic priorities, right? The infrastructure bill that was passed, the massive stimulus bills amid COVID, the attempts to get the Build Back Better World passed, which ended up not succeeding. More recently, the biggest gun legislation package in 30 years in the US, right? His focus is domestic, and he's not going to pick a fight with his own party over a trade deal. So what was presented to the economic managers in the Biden administration was, go figure out how to do a trade deal that doesn't require approval from the US Congress and doesn't require any changes to US domestic legislation, because that's why you have to go to the Congress for a free trade agreement in the US, because you have to change US tariff lines and US domestic law. If you're not going to do that, then as Ambassador Quisha said, you're stuck with an economic agreement that doesn't offer market access, because you can't offer market access unless you seek congressional ratification, and they're not going to seek congressional ratification. So the IPEF is an attempt to throw everything they can think of into an economic package except market access, everything that doesn't actually require them to make legal changes to US statutes. And of course, they had to bake that into the both domestic and international policies they promoted so far. Big part of that being decarbonization and green infrastructure. So that's why that's in there. The anti-corruption taxation pillar, the fourth pillar that nobody really knows what it means or why it's there. That's because anti-corruption and taxation has been a big part of their message abroad. Supply chain resiliency has been talked about in every meeting, basically, that a U.S. official has gone abroad for the last year and a half, right? When Vice President Harris was in Singapore and Vietnam last year, she talked about supply chain resiliency. So did Secretary of Defense Austin, which should not be his job, when he was in Singapore, Vietnam, and Philippines. So clearly that's a priority. So that's why we have IPEF, why we have this Frankenstein that is not really what everybody wants, but maybe it'll become just good enough that it's worth sticking with, that it'll be worth countries remaining in. When it comes to the breakdown of the four pillars, what you're seeing is the division of labor within the US government between those supportive of free trade and those not. So we have these four pillars, as Ambassador Quisha said. Now they are, pillar one is basically everything related to trade: environment, labor, digital economy, trade facilitation, and so on. Everything except market access. So that's the trade piece of this. And that is being negotiated by the Department of the US Trade Representative. Now, traditionally, the legal mandate of the US Trade Representative is to promote market access for US companies abroad. That's their congressional authority. This USTR believes that that is bad, or at least that reciprocal market access is bad. And so you have, ironically, a USTR that doesn't believe in free trade. So nobody really knows what's going to happen in pillar one. Pillar two is supply chain resiliency. Pillar three is infrastructure and decarbonization. Pillar four is the anti-corruption taxation. All of those three are being run by the Department of Commerce, which is the pro-trade part of the equation now. And there will also be buy-in, of course, from other departments. So you imagine that the Department of Energy will have some role in the decarbonization piece, that maybe Treasury, Department of Labor, what have you, will come in with specific initiatives. The split that you get therefore is that, I think as everybody views it, pillar one, the trade pillar, is largely going to be sticks. It's demands, things the US is demanding unilaterally from partners without really offering any concessions. And then the other three pillars, the one that Commerce is running, are supposed to be the carrots. So Commerce is supposed to figure out how to pack as much good stuff, attractive incentives as they can think of, into those other pillars, that it makes the whole package work. Now, I said I'm cautiously optimistic. I know that so far I haven't sounded it, but I am cautiously optimistic for a few reasons. One, I do think that those other pillars, at least the infrastructure decarbonization pillar and the supply chain pillar, are attractive to most partners in the region. That's why the Philippines joined. That's why every other country, for the most part, of the now 14 who are in, joined, because they like those two pillars. Nobody really knows what to make of the anti-corruption and taxation pillar. That's obviously difficult for some of our partners. Malaysia might soon have a prime minister under active investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So, maybe they don't want to jump into an anti-corruption taxation pillar with the US. And then the trade pillar, I think everybody's willing to kind of hold their nose for now and see what develops, but really they're there because of the other two. So that's one reason I'm cautiously optimistic. I do think that there's real stuff here that people want. The other reason I'm optimistic is because of the there we go. So the initial assumption going in was that IPEF would include obviously what we might think of as the usual suspects, the advanced developed economies of the Indo-Pacific, who already largely agree with the US on many of these issues. So Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps South Korea. And you get those in the US, and that's your kind of 6 or 7 who are going to agree on most issues. Those are the only ones who are likely to be part of the trade pillar at the end of the day, because they also don't have to change any of their domestic legislation to meet all of these requirements, right? They already meet all of them, whether it's through their own bilateral FTAs or their previous engagement in TPP, so on. And then other than those usual suspects, those 5 or 6, everybody knew that the big gets were going to be the biggest economies in Southeast Asia. So the administration was hyper-focused on making sure Indonesia was in as the biggest developing economy in the region that had not been in TPP. They really wanted to make sure Vietnam was in. And beyond that, they weren't really sure. So in the early discussions about IPEF, what I kept hearing was, the usual suspects, the developed economies, plus Indonesia and Vietnam. Eventually, it was presented, I think, quite rightly to the administration that they can't leave out the Philippines and Thailand. Malaysia needs to be there because they're part of TPP. And eventually, that argument by the US Embassy and State Department won the day. The Philippines and Thailand were invited somewhat late in the process, as was Malaysia. And Brunei kind of snuck in the back door at the last minute. But still, the ones that everybody didn't think were going to happen was India. I don't think anybody really believed that India was actually going to either be invited at the end of the day, because it was a very active debate within the US government, or that they would agree to join. I mean, think about it. India is not part of APEC because for 30 years, everybody else in APEC has assumed that the Indians would wreck the thing if we let them in. They don't productively engage in the WTO for the most part. They backed out of the RCEP at the 11th hour. They have not implemented, they're the only partner besides the US that hasn't implemented their +1 FTA with ASEAN. India does not do free trade. So it was somewhat surprising that the US decided to go for it and that Delhi reciprocated. It was also unclear at the very end, it really looked like Indonesia and Vietnam were both backing away. Like, ironically, it was clear that the Philippines was all in. Thailand was all in. They had gone on the record saying that. And Jakarta and Hanoi were both getting nervous because without market access, worried that there was just going to be a lot of bad asks and not a lot of carrots. The US managed to bring them in, mostly by leaning on other partners. They got the Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians to push Jakarta and Hanoi into this. And they did it by weakening some of the language. So originally the idea, I think going into President Biden's trip to Japan when this was going to be announced a little over a month ago, was that it was basically going to announce an intention to negotiate high standard agreements. And instead, what came out of the joint statement was, we're starting a process to decide what we're going to negotiate eventually. It was very weak. But in any case, 13 countries signed. And then somehow they added Fiji a couple weeks later, which I still don't quite understand. But so now we have 14. And that gives me a great deal of optimism, because now, whatever this turns out to be, there's a lot of weight behind it, right? IPEF, if it actually becomes something, whatever it becomes, is the largest economic grouping in the world outside the WTO. It is the largest regional economic grouping in the world. By having both the US and India and Japan in the room, it is larger than RCEP, It's much larger than TPP. So anything it does is going to have considerable momentum and weight. And I think that helps with one of the big dangers in IPEF. A lot of people were understandably worried that because the Biden administration wasn't bringing in the Congress, wasn't offering market access, IPEF would end up just like TPP. The second President Biden left office, his successor would kill it, just like President Trump killed TPP. But now that you've got all of these countries involved, there's going to be an enormous incentive for anybody to continue, right? Maybe you want to tweak it a little bit, add an extra letter to it like they did with TPP, but whether it's a Republican or a Democrat I think there will be a lot of people in their own party arguing, you don't want to drop this thing now. You got the Indians there, for God's sakes. We can never get the Indians into anything. So all of that makes me somewhat optimistic. It's also clear on the membership that part of the deal for getting all of these countries in was that membership remain an open door, right? So no country is explicitly out. We all know that one country is implicitly out. There's no world in which China joins, but nobody's going to say that publicly. The other deal was that we don't include Taiwan. So a lot of people in the Biden administration wanted to include Taiwan. They're in APEC. Taiwan didn't get in. Instead, Taiwan got their own bilateral initiative launched 2 weeks later that is basically a bilateral IPEF, all the exact same stuff, but we're just going to do it bilaterally with the Taiwanese. But this also, by having an open door, it means that there is a path eventually to accession by Cambodia, Laos, a future government in Myanmar. It is possible to think of expanding this farther in the Pacific Islands and in South Asia. A lot of folks in the US and probably in other major economies would like to see it expand to the other Pacific Rim countries like Canada and Mexico that are part of TPP, but for some reason not part of this. So if it works over the next year, I think we'll see others joining on, much in the same way that now we have Korea and the UK and even China knocking down the door of TPP to get in. So what's the path forward? Well, they announced 14 countries, 13 signed the statement in Tokyo a month and a half ago, and then Fiji came in as number 14. The next step is to announce the negotiating groups, 4 negotiating groups, 1 for each pillar. And obviously everybody's going to be in on infrastructure, and everybody's going to be in on supply chains. I think most will be in on the other 2 for now, but they might drop off once the negotiations really get difficult. That was expected to happen in about a month. Obviously it hasn't. So already, trade negotiations are hard. Surprise, surprise. I do think we're likely to get some kind of announcement this summer in the next month or so, because there's really no cost to it. Nobody's agreed anything yet. They're just agreeing to which of the 4 pillars they want to talk about. And then we'll start the real discussions. And those will go on for who knows how long. Certainly there's going to be an incentive to get some kind of early harvests. And those early harvests will likely be in the infrastructure and supply chain pillars because that's what everybody wants. It's also noteworthy that the supply chain and infrastructure pillars are the 2 things that I think everybody knows the US would be doing either way. So whether you're in IPEF or not, the US is going to come knocking on your door about supply chain diversification, supply chain resiliency. The US is going to come knocking on your door alongside the Japanese to talk about green energy infrastructure and, moving off of coal. So you're not giving up anything by engaging in those. The trade, I don't know. I'm skeptical. I do think that there is one major opportunity still on the table, and it's an active debate within the US government and among a lot of the partners in IPEF. And that is whether or not we need to split digital economy into its own pillar. The trade pillar right now is, as Ambassador Quisha said earlier, everything, right? It's labor, it's environment, it's trade facilitation and standards, all of these things that without market access, most of the economies aren't going to agree to, right? I mean, imagine going to the Vietnamese and saying, we want you to agree to all the labor standards that you originally negotiated in TPP, which you only agreed to in exchange for US market access. But now we want you to do it without the market access. Vietnam's going to laugh in our faces. So if you can split digital economy off, which is actually attractive, from those more difficult things and have 2 separate negotiations, the USTR can still run them both. One would be the high standard trade agreement, And guess what? Whether or not digital is there, it's only going to be the same 6 countries at the end of the day. It's going to be the US, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe Korea. Those are the only 6 that are ever going to sign a deal on this trade pillar, whether or not digital is there. But if you take digital out, you make it its own thing, then you get all those 6 plus, I think you get the Philippines. I think you get Malaysia. You might get Thailand. You'll probably get Fiji and Brunei. You probably still don't get Vietnam and Indonesia, not at first, but you get a much better deal by having digital separate. And it provides a stepping stone, right? Digital is one of those areas where you can find trade facilitation measures, you can find regulation, standard setting that would really make a difference, particularly to small and medium-sized enterprises without market access. That's the one place in trade where you can really think of improving business prospects even without increased market access. And for the Philippines, it's kind of perfect timing, given one, the Philippines is currently the only member of ASEAN that agrees to all the current APEC standards on digital privacy. So it's the closest to the US and Japan on that issue. It's got the booming BPO sector and a wide open digital economy, unlike almost any of the partners in ASEAN other than Singapore. And with the new amendment to the Public Service Act, there's a significant opening here where the Philippine economy is far more open on telecoms and digital trade than it is on most other issues, which has for long been the barrier to a US-Philippine FTA. All of that said, and you know, this is all up in the air, and we all are kind of in wait and see mode. I think there's going to be a long process. I think everybody sees value in engaging in it for now. Until they don't, right? If it all falls apart, then of course people run for the exit. But for now, everybody who's in sees value in engaging. And I think there's 2 possible ways this can go. We're not going to get a high standard trade agreement out of IPEF. I think I've made that clear. We could, if digital is split out and you get a real robust digital agreement, you know, the first of its type digital economy agreement to include this many big countries. Plus, you get some really productive early harvest on supply chain resiliency and infrastructure, then this could be the stepping stone to something more robust, to eventually US reaccession to something like TPP, either in a second Biden administration or a future administration. But in any case, this would show that the US is actually willing to engage in new rule setting. And I think we can all agree that the digital economy is the most important arena right now for rule setting when it comes to economics. If the US misses this opportunity, then we're going to continue to see the balkanization, the fracturing of the online space into 2 to 3 camps, right? The Chinese model of walled gardens, of digital sovereignty, which is very attractive to those like Vietnam, versus the open model preferred by the US and Japan and Singapore. And somewhere in the middle, you have the European model that's mostly open, but with GDPR requirements that are somewhat onerous. And that's where Indonesia is already at. It's where Thailand and Malaysia are heading if we don't stop them. You can imagine this at some point even leading down the line to the long hoped for FTAP, a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, right? Because you'll have a grouping now that's much bigger than TPP, but includes almost all of the TPP members. Throw in the Pacific Rim economies and you've got TPP plus. Option 2 is if you don't get a digital agreement, then what you have is a talk shop. You have a talk shop on trade, including digital. You have a talk shop on infrastructure, a talk shop on supply chains, and a talk shop on taxation. And that's not what people want, but it could be valuable if it's a talk shop that actually facilitates agreement. If it actually brings people together to talk about infrastructure standards and early harvest projects, then what you've created, it would seem to me, is a replacement for APEC, because this gets very awkward. If you're talking about all this stuff in IPEF and everybody is there except the Taiwanese and the Chinese, plus the Indians, what is APEC's role anymore? So you could either end up with a CPTPP 2.0, or you can end up with an APEC 2.0, or this whole thing could blow up. But those are the three options I see. And why don't I go ahead and wrap there for now. Thank you for listening. Maraming salamat po. I welcome any questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Poling. That was very insightful, and I hope our audience can, very much free to participate in asking questions. Either please share them in the chat box or raise your hand if you have any questions. I think we have an initial question already from Ambassador Quisia. And Ambassador, would you like to read out your question, or would you like me to do it?
You can go ahead and read it, Bettina.
All right. So Ambassador Quisi's question is, without market access, doesn't IPEF suffer by comparison to RCEP? Is it not possible to get bipartisan support for a TPP-like agreement that the U.S. Congress will pass?
Yes, it does suffer. Not just in comparison to RCEP, but to TPP, and in different ways. So I'm, as I think most Americans are, an RCEP skeptic. I think when you really look at RCEP, the reason that the Philippine Congress has not ratified RCEP is because it doesn't actually grant any new market access to the Philippines, right? It is no different than the ASEAN plus one FTA with China, plus the ASEAN plus one FTA with Korea, plus the ASEAN plus one FTA with Japan. So there's no new market access in RCEP for the ASEAN countries. The only real benefit is the three-way Japan, Korea, China trade in RCEP. And even that's pretty low standard, right? The number of tariff lines they're really knocking down is pretty low compared to what they already have eliminated. So RCEP is really a lowest common denominator trade agreement. From the US trade, if you had gone to USTR before the current USTR, back when the USTR was actually trying to negotiate trade agreements, their take on RCEP was that it wasn't really an FTA at all. It was just a codification of the ASEAN plus one FTAs. But what RCEP does is it gives China a huge narrative win. It lets China claim that it is engaging in economic rulemaking for the benefit of the region, and the US is sitting on the sidelines. So in that sense, continuing to refuse to have a real FTA talk plays into China's storyline that the US is a one-trick pony, that we do not do economics. The far more worrying thing for me is that this, without market access, IPEF continues to disappoint compared to TPP, which is the thing everybody actually wants, right? TPP is a 21st century agreement with digital standards and labor standards and environment standards, all the stuff that RCEP doesn't have. And the US was the one who helped write those rules, and then we walked away from it. So I am quite concerned about that. And I do think there's a path forward here. I think one of the reasons that the early champions of IPEF, Japan, Singapore, Australia in particular, the reason that they push so hard for this, and the reason that they continue to push the US to do a separate digital agreement, is because they see it as a halfway step to TPP. They know that when they say that, the American officials all say, no, it's not. We're not going to join TPP. But Tokyo and Canberra and Singapore continue to see it that way. They believe that this is a way to kind of drag the Americans back in to the trade game so that a future administration will find it easier to just rejoin TPP. To your question about whether or not it's possible to get something like TPP ratified by the Congress, I don't know. I really don't. I think so. I think it could be, but it would take significant effort and political capital from the US president. And this US president has made clear that he won't do that. Now, to be clear, so did President Obama. President Obama did not spend any political capital in trying to get TPP supported on the Hill until it was too late, right? He waited until the dying days of the administration to then try to rush through an agreement, and he couldn't get it done. What President Obama had and what President Trump had that President Biden doesn't have is trade promotion authority, right? So trade promotion authority allows the administration to pass a trade deal with a simple majority, 50 seats plus the vice president, which is how many they got. Without that, you need 2/3. And there is no, you could pass a treaty that says the sky is blue and you couldn't get it passed by 2/3 of the Senate in the US right now. So without Trade Promotion Authority, it can't happen. And the Biden administration has shown no interest in negotiating Trade Promotion Authority, even though there are members of Congress in both parties who are getting so sick of this that they're going to pass Trade Promotion Authority themselves, which has never happened. In US history, the Congress has never independently granted Trade Promotion Authority. They might do it just because they're tired of the White House saying that it can't be done.
But couldn't President Biden also get trade promotion authority from Congress?
He could,
Like
but
Trump?
he hasn't. They haven't even asked.
But why
So if
not?
you want to know, are they serious about negotiating on trade? No,
Yeah.
because
Oh.
they haven't even asked for TPA. And until they do, it's clear that they're not interested at all. And one of the more head scratching things, so TPA has always come as a package deal because you need to, right? TPA is what the Republicans want. But Republicans want free trade historically. That's no longer the case as the polling shows, but historically Republicans wanted trade and therefore Democrats wanted trade assistance, right?
Yeah.
So in any trade agreement, there are losers. Whether it's you're in the U.S., your garment manufacturing industry, and that was crushed by the move of a lot of textiles to Mexico after passing the North American Free Trade Agreement, and as a result, we came up with the trade something assistance. I'm sorry, it's late here and I'm blanking on the acronyms. Trade adjustment assistance. Sorry. It's money given by the Congress to workers who can prove they lost their jobs because of trade diversion due to trade deals. So that's what got Democrats in. Recently, as part of what we can just call the China bill here in the US, this massive competition act that's supposed to do everything, promote chip manufacturing and everything else, Democrats look like they're likely to get trade adjustment assistance without TPA, which has never happened before. So if that happens, then ironically, you kind of lose half the reason that the Congress ever agreed to TPA in the first place.
Greg, if job creation is so important to President Biden, why doesn't he precisely push for TPA in Congress?
I think there are two possible explanations here. Obviously, I don't know the president's mind. I don't think that he's a protectionist at heart, right? I mean, he's been deeply involved in trade negotiations for 3 decades in the Senate, so there's no reason to think that he's a protectionist. One is that he honestly believes that it can't pass, that particularly the Democratic Party, there's no support. And my take is that is wrong. I think the polling shows that Democrats are supportive of free trade, particularly if bundled with the right kind of assistance. But that doesn't, just because, politicians are people like everybody else, they can believe things that are false. So that's one possibility. The other option is that he knows it could be done, but it would be a huge fight. And presidents can't do everything, right? Every bill you get passed through the legislature is one that you couldn't, because you have, for President Obama, he had to spend most of the first term fighting on healthcare. So 100 other things couldn't happen. And for President Biden, I think he believes that he was elected at a moment of crisis, domestic crisis, and his job is to secure democracy, to shore up, a battered economy after COVID. And I think he probably became convinced that he was supposed to be a transformational president like FDR, and that's why he pushed Build Back Better World. And if he had to fight members of both parties over trade promotion authority, he wouldn't have been able to do all that. Now, ironically, of course, he didn't get to do all that anyway. But, they spent 6 months trying to pass Build Back Better World.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for that explanation.
All right. We'll get to some of the questions in the chat box. One is from LJ Lombos. Thanks, Greg, for the analysis. Just curious, IPEF doesn't seem to have any dispute settlement mechanism in place in contrast with other trade agreements. So, how will Washington ensure that commitments are properly enforced by partners? And what do you think would probably be the sanctions for enforcement for non-compliance?
Well, IPEF doesn't have doesn't have any dispute settlement mechanism yet, and that's because it's not a thing yet, right? I mean, we've announced the start of negotiations. There's no document. There's no negotiation yet. So, I mean, I can almost guarantee that there will be a dispute settlement mechanism in the trade pillar. The USTR will insist on it. I don't know if there will be in the other three pillars or if there will be an overall IPEF dispute settlement mechanism. I mean, who knows, right? How many years did it take to negotiate TPP? Usually the dispute settlement mechanism is one of the last things that gets hammered out. So it'll be there. And we've got models for it. I mean, we can look at what the U.S. has baked into NAFTA, now the USMCA, what we negotiated in TPP. The difficulty here is, so it can maybe work in the trade pillar if it's among, as I said, the usual suspects, where everybody already agrees to all of these things, and it doesn't require any changes to anybody's domestic legislation. It's hard to see how it could work more broadly because generally the dispute settlement mechanism basically boils down to retaliatory tariffs, right? Other guy breaks the rules, so I'm going to place countervailing duties on his products. This is the way it works in the WTO, and therefore it's the way it works in most regional trade agreements. Now, there's also, of course, arbitration mechanisms, but what do you arbitrate if there's not legally binding commitments on tariff lines and the like? So I'm sure there will be some kind of conciliation mechanism in the trade part for, it'll probably look just like USMCA and the US-Japan digital agreement because, we won't be agreeing anything new. We'll just be wrapping up all of these pre-existing agreements into this new pillar.
LG, does that answer your question, or would you happen to have any follow-up questions? He's still in the room. Well, anyway, I'll move on to the question of Michael Ostik from the DFA, Department of Foreign Affairs, and he works for DFA APEC. And his question is, thank you for mentioning the global CBPR. How do you think will this figure into the IPEF discussions? Will it be the same, different, unique areas? How might the GCBPR forum evolve with IPEF as GCPBR is relatively more open to members?
It's a great question, and I don't have any answers. So since this is for the most part a large umbrella bringing together like-minded countries, and the ones who join each pillar are likely to be the ones who are already like-minded. When it comes to digital economy and privacy issues, what you're likely to have are those parties who already largely agree with each other joining that pillar, and that's likely to include members already of CBPR. How much it expands beyond that, I really have no idea. We'll have to see how things get negotiated. And this is one of the difficulties, I know, the frustrations of talking about IPEF this early. We've got 14 countries, some of whom have never agreed to any economic agreement of any sort ever. So they don't have any history to look at here, and they haven't even really begun negotiations. So beyond the broad strokes and kind of speculation, we don't really have a lot to base any of these conclusions on.
Michael, do you have a follow-up question?
I'm good. Thank you very much for that.
All right. Mr. Averitt has a question. How do you see the evolving global macroeconomic situation, especially with inflationary measures, pressures, looming recessions, etc., impacting IPEF countries' appetites/abilities to engage in the I'm
I'm heartened by what we've seen in the latest round of the WTO negotiations. I think that there was and there remains considerable worry that the post-COVID inflationary cycle, now worsened by skyrocketing energy prices and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, would lead countries to abandon free trade in favor of protectionism. And there has been a fair amount of beggar thy neighbor policy, including in Asia, right? I point to Indonesia's ill-considered ban on palm oil exports, Malaysia banning chicken exports to Singapore, right? This gets exporting their inflation abroad, and it ended up rebounding on them. But for the most part, what we've seen from the latest WTO negotiation is the opposite. Countries seem to be rallying and still wanting to get things done. We have a too little, too late agreement on vaccine patents. We have a much more important agreement on fisheries subsidies. We have real robust discussions on food security. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that sentiment will carry on into IPEF. I mean, that we'll see the same kind of behavior reflected there that we're seeing right now on the global stage, which means that I think for most of these governments, they still believe that the best way to fight inflation is to lower trade barriers, not to raise them. That could change. I mean, the longer this goes on, and certain countries in IPEF are going to be problems. India and Indonesia lead that list for me. But for the most part, I think the weight will be toward trying to find ways to, even without increased market access or lowering trade and goods tariffs, to facilitate trade, promote trade in order to combat the sinking global economy. The two areas where I see this being most important, I really don't know what's going to come out of the supply chain pillar, but there's two clear areas, right, where this directly speaks to current issues. One is the energy and infrastructure pillar. Given the difficult conversations we're now having because of skyrocketing energy prices, and particularly the European problem with loss of access to Russian gas, there's certainly going to be a new discussion around energy transition. And I think this will, while it's not going to be popular in all parts of the president's party, this will force the US into a more honest conversation about the role of LNG in particular in that energy mix, which will make the energy pillar more attractive to our partners in Asia, because everybody looks at a graph of energy demand, knows that you're not going to build enough solar and wind to meet new demand in Asia, much less existing demand. And so if you want to avoid building, Chinese financed coal plants, then the US and Japan, among others, needs to finance more LNG in the region. And if this current moment in global energy markets gets the US to recognize that and admit it, then that'll make that pillar of IPEF all the more attractive. The second is, as I said, the digital economy. There's been a knee-jerk reaction in the US, particularly among the Democratic Party, but also in parts of Asia, and I hear it most often in places like Indonesia, that talk about digital economic agreements is a giveaway to big tech, right? That this is going to help Google and Amazon, and it's not going to help mom and pop shops. But the fact is that is exactly the opposite, right? It doesn't matter to Google if it has to deal with 14 different regulatory regimes in the 14 IPEF countries. It's got enough lawyers to manage it. Rationalizing digital regulatory regimes across the region is of most benefit to small and medium-sized companies who cannot afford to compete in global markets if they have to meet 20 different versions of GDPR when they try to go abroad. And so COVID showed us that it forced not just big companies, but small companies throughout the Indo-Pacific, including the Philippines, to go online. And if they want to get outside of their own national boundaries, they're going to need a coherent, shared set of regulations. And IPEF can provide that without lowering tariffs, without market access. If IPEF does nothing but come up with shared digital privacy regulations, that will be an enormous win for normal citizens and small businesses across the region.
All right.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, excuse me. Thanks, Greg. I really appreciate your response and your brief here. It's fascinating discussion. We're lucky to have you come talk to everyone here. Just as a follow-up to your response, I'm curious about the LNG issues. Do you think there's enough non-Russian LNG supply on the market to meet the region's energy transition demands? Over.
I don't want to cop out here, but I'm going to admit I'm not an energy economist. We got a whole energy program at CSIS, and they're bigger than my Southeast Asia program. What I think they'd say the answer is that no, we don't have enough supply to meet future demand. We have more than enough supply to meet current demand, and if it's clear that demand is going to grow, then supply will grow. Right? I mean, that's the way this works. This seems to be particularly attractive in Asia because, unlike Europe, Asian economies so far have been willing to sign long-term contracts for LNG, which Europe's not willing to do, which could make prices less volatile and give producers the kind of security that they need to make the investments to increase production. One of I think the most promising options we have is building LNG import and LNG generation facilities that can easily transition in the future to hydrogen. So, we have no supply right now of clean hydrogen. It doesn't exist. All liquid hydrogen is dirty hydrogen by definition. But if we get to a point where a country like, say, Australia, that wants to invest tens of billions of dollars in renewable green hydrogen, can do that with some surety that it will be able to replace LNG without countries needing to build new power plants, then that could open up a whole new, stream of energy that could actually make LNG the bridge to a green energy future that we all kind of say it is, but without really understanding what that means. But if you can tell the Philippines, hey, build an LNG import terminal and a power plant that can run for the next 15 years in LNG and then seamlessly transition to green hydrogen, that's enormously attractive.
All right. Mr. Averitt, do you have any other follow-up questions, or you're good? We can't hear you, sorry. But yeah, I'll call on Coco. I think Coco has a question.
I always have questions, but I before I jump into that, please, I do invite everybody here. If you have any questions, please type them in. Greg, this is a great discussion. Thanks so much. And there's a lot to ask and a lot to learn. So please, I do invite everyone to throw in their questions and take advantage of this opportunity. I'll stop right now. Actually, Julian has a question, so I'll turn to Julian.
Yes, thanks, Coco. A fabulous discussion. Of course, the big question is what other countries in the Americas will possibly join this? And the issue will be that this appears to have been an American-designed framework. If these other countries decide to join, I have no idea whether they will or not, are they going to ask for modifications in it? And is it open to modifications by other non-Asian countries which wish to join this framework? Thank you.
It's a fantastic question, Julian, because this is what we saw in TPP, right? Canada and Mexico were latecomers, and their entry delayed the negotiations by at least a year because, of course, they expected to have a voice. They weren't going to join without any input into the agreement. So presumably there will have to be some kind of opening for modification. Now, one of the things that perhaps makes this easier in IPEF is that it's not a trade agreement. At best, it's going to be like 4 different agreements. And my guess is that you'll actually have multiple agreements within each of the pillars. And so presumably there will be room for adjustment on some, but not all. There will be this kind of a la carte approach here. I would suspect that for countries like Canada, Mexico, Chile, those who are already part of high standard trade agreements, this will be easier because, as I said, there is no new market access being granted here. So there's really no new demands. I mean, the trade pillar of IPEF is just going to be TPP without some of the standards. So I doubt that there will actually be anything required of a current TPP member to change in order for them to join the trade pillar. Supply chains and infrastructure, that could be very different, but nobody knows what's going to be in it. Digital is the other big question. Nobody knows what's going to be in a digital agreement. That remains to be negotiated.
May I have a follow-up question, Coco?
Of course, Julian, go ahead.
Okay, on the digitalization framework, it strikes me there's a potential for great degree of discussion and possible disagreement because the regularization of digitalization is going to affect more than just technical matters. It's going to affect everything from freedom of speech to everything else. So do you anticipate that moving that quickly when you see the different interests of different countries in controlling information coming up to the table when we discuss these regulations?
It's a very tough question. So I guess it depends on how many of these 14 join. If all 14 join, if we're trying to negotiate a digital economy agreement with India, then of course nothing will move quickly. If we're trying to negotiate a digital economy agreement with the current TPP members and maybe a couple of like-mindeds like the Philippines, countries who basically already agree on the types of standards that are already in, say, DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, and who already agree on many of the privacy regulations under APEC, then that could be relatively easy because then you'd be codifying and mildly expanding existing rules. There also, again, nothing says that this has to be a single agreement. There could be an early harvest digital agreement among those already largely in agreement on some of the regulatory practices, and then efforts to negotiate something more ambitious over time. If I were to put the 14 that are on the list now, kind of where they fall here, I don't have any expectation that a year from now, we will be talking about India, Indonesia, Vietnam having joined a digital agreement, because those three countries have wildly different approaches, in many cases, kind of wildly different worldviews about what the internet's supposed to be and what the nature of competition is online. And in Vietnam's case, what the scope of state sovereignty is in the online space. For other countries, I do think that we can get a relatively early deal. I mean, not 3 months from now, but maybe 2 years from now. And by the standards of FTAs, 2 years is pretty quick.
Well, thank you for a fabulous discussion. Thank you to AmCham and Makati Business Club. This has really been, I found, most informative. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Payne, for those questions. Very interesting. Greg, we'll now get to some questions that have been sent to us earlier. And one of them is, so I think you mentioned that the incentives for the IPEF are not yet clear or completely laid out yet. However, I guess one of the main topics for today is what's in it for the Philippines. So what do you think the Philippines should look forward to or would look forward to incentive wise, or what sort of advantages you think the Philippines should definitely get on when this does pull through, whether it's in the digital sphere or the infrastructure sphere, which you mentioned are the two areas that ASEAN countries would be most interested in. So yeah, like what incentives do you think the Philippines would be interested in, and how can we actually benefit from it?
I suppose the most obvious answer is any new funding of any sort, wherever it comes from for infrastructure, is going to be welcomed. Not just by the Philippines, but throughout the region, but I mean, also clearly by the Philippines. It's going to be a priority of the new administration, as it was for the last two. And so, in as much as the infrastructure pillar actually includes some kind of frameworks to facilitate more funding from the US and Japan and Korea, and maybe unlock more funding from the MDBs, then that's going to be enormously attractive. In as much as I said that IPEF may include a separate digital agreement, this should be enormously attractive to the Philippines. The Philippines has far and ahead the most open digital economy in ASEAN behind Singapore. It is head and shoulders above Indonesia and Vietnam, and it is leading Malaysia and Thailand when it comes to, online regulatory standards that are attractive to US and Japanese and Korean companies in particular. That doesn't mean there's no room for future regulation. I think the US is starting to finally recognize that we've lost some of the GDPR debate, in as much that individual US states are just going ahead and passing their own GDPR regulations ahead of the federal government. So these things have to be negotiated, but clearly the thriving BPO sector, among others, makes greater market access abroad and greater regulatory coherence in bigger economies like Japan and the US very attractive to Philippine IT companies. On the supply chain resiliency, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this, right? I mean, we know what the goal is. The goal is to take, I think they've established 4 areas, chips, vaccines and healthcare, PPE and materials, rare earths, and I'm blanking on one other, maybe with batteries or something. I mean, some of these are areas where the Philippines has a comparative advantage, particularly in high tech, right? I mean, the reason that the PESA zones exist largely was because of their early attractiveness to Western technology companies. So there are clearly places here where the Philippines could benefit from a diversion of some of these supply chains from China. I think everybody rightly recognizes that, Vietnam has gotten the jump on a lot of this, and Vietnam will continue to benefit. But I think the Philippines is pretty well placed to get a piece of this pie. At least it's well placed to say Indonesia, and is often overlooked in the discussion.
Got it. Ambassador Quisia, do you have a question related to that?
Yes, not really. Well, it is with regard to infrastructure. I recall that when Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker came to the Philippines sometime in, I think, 2015, I was encouraging her to try to get US companies to participate more actively in the infrastructure projects in the Philippines, because very few actually had any involvement in infrastructure, as well as in the energy sector. I actually had arranged a very fruitful meeting between the CEO of one of the largest American companies involved in energy here in the Philippines with President Aquino, and they had a very good meeting. However, I think 3 years later, they sold out of the Philippines. And we've not seen any new American companies in the energy sector. So I was wondering if you might have any insight on why is it that when we look at the major infrastructure projects in the Philippines, hardly any US participation.
I think both sides share some fault here. One, the US does not have a lot of companies who can compete globally on infrastructure, right? There's a reason that today over half of all contractors in World Bank funded projects are Chinese, right? Not Chinese funded projects, but like when Japan and the US fund projects through the World Bank, more than half of the contractors are Chinese because they just have the comparative advantage. The US doesn't build bridges and roads and ports anymore. We don't even build them at home, much less abroad. Now, if you're driving on a foreign-built bridge or road in the Philippines, it's probably Japanese funded, not Chinese funded, but that's not the case in many other countries. And so part of it is just that US companies have lost their comparative advantage in most of these areas. The exceptions, as you indicated, are energy and to some degree, digital infrastructure. The US does still have comparative advantages here, but in traditional hard transportation infrastructure, you're just not going to find US companies who can compete on a commercial basis. You will have the random exceptions like Millennium Challenge Corporation funded projects that the US does, but those are going to be few and far between. But part of the fault also rests on the Philippine side. The Philippines is not the easiest place to do business in the region. Historically, the restrictions on foreign ownership, particularly in public services and critical areas, has made it less attractive to commercial enterprises. Not that you can't make money in the Philippines, but that you can probably make it a little bit easier in Vietnam or a little bit easier in Malaysia. And so companies have tended to divert more and more over the last 30 years to those economies. And I think some of that's going to start coming back. But look, if we look at just the last 5 years from the Chinese side, I mean, how many ribbon cutting ceremonies were there by Chinese companies during the Duterte presidency for massive infrastructure projects? And what did you get out of it? 2 bridges? Part of that's China's fault, but part of it is also just that those Chinese companies found it a lot harder to do business than they expected in the Philippines.
But Greg, in the past, in the 70s and 80s, with a company like Bechtel, which was very active in the Philippines, I think they built some ports, airports, and so on. But then I don't know whether they still have any operation in the Philippines, but certainly they're no longer as active as they were. I think companies like Fluor also in the past were quite active. So I don't know exactly what reason, but I did in fact mention this to Secretary Pritzker, and I said, we're hoping that we could attract them to come back into the Philippines. Huh? Anyway, just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will note that Brendan Bechtel is currently the chair of the board of CSIS. So the next time I see him, okay. I will ask.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Quisia. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand or get on the chat box. And if not, we can actually move to close. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Polling. It's I think been such a fruitful discussion for everyone, and thank you everyone for your questions as well. Especially this is the first economic briefing event that we have, and we're super glad to partner with AmCham, and we are hoping to do more of these in the coming months. Usually we're planning to make it sort of I wouldn't say reactive, but sort of responsive type of briefing, depending on any geopolitical or economic issues that would arise in the coming months. We invite your comments and feedback on today's event. And by the way, Mr. Polling, I have a final question just to insert. Is that a U.S. jeepney or a Philippine jeepney behind you?
That's a Philippine jeepney. I have one here and one at my office in DC. So this is my gold jeepney. The other one's a little more colorful.
That's nice. I've never seen a gold jeepney before. Not even.
I don't remember who gave it to me. It says Mabuhay on it. It was definitely a gift from somebody.
All right. Well, we are looking forward to having you back in the Philippines soon. And yeah, we just please scan the QR code on your screens and the link provided in the chat box for if you'd like to give your feedback. And please follow us on Facebook at Makati Business Club Incorporated and MBC Forum on Twitter, Makati Business Club on LinkedIn. And before we go, may I invite Ambassador Quisia again to express our thanks.
On behalf of the Makati Business Club, I wish to thank my good friend, Mr. Greg Polling, for the very incisive analysis of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I think you will all agree with me that we have a better understanding of the framework, and I believe that the framework provides very attractive benefits for the 14 signatory countries. Although I'm concerned that without the market access, some of those countries may not stay on. But I do hope that they will see that there are worthwhile benefits for them to continue, the 14 initial signatories, and hopefully there will be even more countries joining the framework. So again, thank you to Greg for also the interesting discussion we had in the question and answer portion of this forum. And I want to thank everyone who has participated in this forum. And I thank Coco and his team for having organized this together with the AmCham. Thank you and have a good day.
Coco, you'd like to
Sure.
say a few words?
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Bettina. Thank you, Ambassador. Greg, of course, thank you. AmCham, thank you very much for partnering with us. The other ambassadors who joined us, thank you so much. And those who asked questions. And finally, of course, to Bettina and our team, thank you very much. For everyone who attended, we hope to see you again very soon. Please have a good day. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you soon again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Coco.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
everybody.
Bettina. Thank you, Bettina, Michelle, and the rest of the team.
Good night, John. Good night, Greg.
Good night, Mr. Foley.
Good night, all.
Good night.
All right. Thank you.